Good evening and welcome to the April 27th Newark Unified School District Board of Education special meeting. We are holding in-person board meetings at our district boardroom and are following the state's and Alameda County safety guidelines for public gatherings. Please refrain from attending in-person meetings if you have COVID-related symptoms. If you're not able to attend the meeting in person, you may observe the meeting via the NUSD YouTube channel or live stream transmission on Comcast channel 26. There is also Spanish translation available via Zoom. In regards to public comment, the public will have the opportunity to address the board regarding non-agendized matters and agendized items with a live audio-only comment via Zoom with an advance notice requested by email at publiccomment@newarkunified.org, a written comment by submitting a speaking card via email at publiccomment@newarkunified.org, or with live in-person comments by submitting a speaker card with the executive assistant. Roll call, please, Ms. Gutierrez.
Board Member Marquez? Present. Board Member Hill?
Here.
Board Member Zhang?
Here.
Vice President Grindal?
Here.
President Nguyen?
Here.
Student Board Member absent.
Thank you. Okay, on to item 2.1, approval of the agenda. May I get a motion to approve the agenda as is? Motion made by Member Marquez.
I'll second.
Seconded by Member Grindal. Roll call. How do you vote, Member Marquez?
Yes.
How do you vote, Member Zhang?
Yes.
How do you vote, Member Hill?
Yes.
How do you vote, Member Grindal?
Here. Yes.
I'm also an aye, so 5 ayes. Thank you. All right, on to consent agenda non-personnel item, item 3.1, circular, non-circular overnight out-of-state field trip for Newark Memorial High School rocketry to Virginia. Superintendent Triplett.
Thank you. Good evening. Am I on? Can you hear me okay? Okay. Good evening, board members and public and staff. Yes, this item, we're really excited that the Rocketry Club has been, what's the word? It's qualified for the national competition in the DC area, in Virginia, I believe. And so we want, although we really wanted to focus the majority of this session on the budget balancing solutions, we did add this just to make sure that we had gotten this in because the trip is coming up. It is on the 11th, so there's another board meeting before then. But just to be safe, we wanted to make sure that we got the item up. So we have 3 different rocketry groups that's qualified to go to this national competition. It's super exciting. They're really jazzed up, and we're actually hoping to have some of the students come and speak at a board meeting in the future and talk a little bit about the experience.
Awesome. Does anyone have any comments or questions?
I just have a comment. First and foremost, good evening, everyone. And I wanted to commend Teacher Burns for moving steadfast and taking care of this and providing our youth the opportunity to participate in something across. For some, it may be the first time that they've actually traveled out of state or on planes. So it's going to be exciting, as well as knowing that we have the 3 teams, right, that are participating. So if there are no other comments, I'm ready to make a motion.
Member Hill?
Thank you. So I understand that the trip and the event is commendable, but I think that given the cuts that we've already had to go through as a district and the fact that we're talking about additional pretty severe cuts in budget balancing right after this agenda item, I just don't think it's appropriate that we fund this at this point until we can get things sort of under control. So, that's my position.
Member Grindal?
So I'm excited for the teams, and when Member Marquez is ready to make her motion, I'm happy to second it.
I just wanted to say congratulations to all the teams that qualified, and wish you all the best of luck when you're headed, once we approve this, for approval and when the team is headed out to the competition. So, Member Marquez?
Just one last comment before I make the actual motion. I do want to commend, again, the teacher, Burns, because in reading the report, I did recognize that there is a GoFundMe and that the students are fundraising to pay for this trip.
That's correct.
I think about the minimal cost is $480 per student, and that's what they're fundraising for because they've taken the time in this short amount of time or period to actually get the fundraising so that, and the funds to pay for the trip so that it doesn't affect what it is that we're working with this evening. So again, thank you, Teacher Burns, and the staff and the parents and the community for making sure that this is an event that will last a lifetime for these students. So if you could please send us an email and let us know the link or provide us the information for the GoFundMe to support these youth and let the community know what it is that we're doing so they can reach this goal, I'd appreciate it. I make the motion that we approve.
I'll second.
Thank you. Motion made by Member Marquez, seconded by Member Grindel. How do you vote, Member Zhang?
Yes.
Member Marquez?
Yes.
Member Hill?
No.
Member Grindel?
Yes.
I'm a yes. Four yeses and one no.
Thank
Thank you.
Sorry, President Nguyen, if I could say, just to be clear, that there are some funds, I believe, that will be coming out of the club, the Rocketry Club funds, but the majority is something that the students do. Like you said, Member Marquez, the students are trying to fundraise for, so the majority of the cost is really something that I believe they're really asking the community to rally around and try to support. So. Yeah, that's just to be clear about that.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, like Member Marcus indicated, board members and the public would love to have the connection to that GoFundMe because as members of the community, we'd be interested in helping.
Yes, I would. I'm in agreement with my fellow board members, Member Marquez and Member Grindel. I'm happy to, if we could get that additional information, we'd love to make a donation to for the trip. Thank you.
Thank you, will do.
Okay, on to our study session, 4.1 budgeting balancing solution. Do you want to make any statements here, Ms. De La Cruz, or should we just move to the table?
Just briefly, the study session is going to be based on the assumptions in the second interim budget report and the multi-year projections and how at this point we are projecting a deficit of $4.5 million in the next fiscal year and $4.7 million in 23-24. So our study session will be focused on how the board has committed to at least implementing solutions of $4.5 million for next year and 4.7 in the following year so that we can have a discussion and incorporate hopefully some of the items that we have come up with in our 22-23 adopted budget.
Great, thank you so much. Let's move on over to the conference table and we'll start our study session. Thank you. I did forget one item, which is the Pledge of Allegiance, so if not, everybody rise. Thank you. Please begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Yeah. It's mainly so that the people on YouTube can hear us, so, yeah.
Oh, okay. No, I missed the clicker for that.
Marie, let me get batteries for you. Or do you want me just to tell me?
Okay. Okay, so good evening, everyone. I've included an attachment on the board agenda item, also printed out for you to follow along if you like. Next slide, please. So what we will be reviewing this evening during the study session is the purpose of the session, which I've already kind of went through before we sat down. And then the board also asked that we review our enrollment and ADA history and projections. And then we have some potential budget balancing solutions that we'd like to present and discuss. And then something new for next year is a reserve cap that we'll be reviewing, and then board discussion. So if you want me to go through the presentation first and then discussion, or discuss as we go along, that's up to you, however you want to.
Be organic.
Yeah.
It would make sense to have some discussion of the solutions sort of at that point.
Sure. Okay, next slide, please. So this is a review of our enrollment and ADA history since 2013-14. You can see how our enrollment in 2013-14 was at 6,294, and then as of our second interim period, our enrollment for this year is down to 5,167. So in terms of how our funding is based, it's based on our ADA, which is average daily attendance, and not enrollment. So our historical ratio of ADA to enrollment has always been about 97 to 98%. However, this year it has gone down due to our COVID situation and protocols. So this year our ratio is at 93%. Our ADA-based funding for the last couple of years has been based on the 1920 ADA, which the state has given us provision to use our ADA from 1920, but that will end at the end of this year. So starting next year, we're back to the regular ADA base, which is either you get funded based on your current year or prior year, whichever is higher. So our ADA projected for next year is a lot lower than our base ADA. It's over 600 ADA lower than our 1920 ADA. So it's going to impact our funding for next year. Yes.
Ms. Delacruz, do you know if, or we won't find out until the May revise, if they're deciding whether or not they're going to average the 3 years, or we just go by prior year and current year?
Yeah, at this time, since we don't have a definite decision by the state, and we probably will have a better idea at May revise, but the legislature probably won't pass the bill until June when they pass the budget. So we have to base our budget right now based on either current year or prior year until, we're hoping the governor's proposal will be approved, which is based on a 3-year average.
Could I just add something in there, Marie? That you used the word hope, and I think that that's really important. All of what we're going to do tonight is based on what we currently know is going to happen. We all hope that the legislature will actually give us some relief, and if they do, then some of these really hard decisions won't be necessary in the same way. But as we all know, we should not be budgeting based on hope. So we have to budget and make the hard decisions, and then if we do get relief from the state, then that'll be a great thing, and we'll be able to revise. However, in the meantime, we want to make sure that we are doing our due diligence and really moving forward with hard decisions based on the current reality.
No, I think that's a conservative approach. It's appropriate. In addition, really the state's talking about sort of a softer landing rather than a sort of an ongoing fix, if I understand the language. So it's prudent for us to be thinking in terms of in terms of how we match our revenues with our expenditures, even though we may have a few years to get it done. I think it's prudent to do it the way you're proposing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the guidance that we received from the county has been based on what we know today, which is current year versus prior year. So
Yeah, we'll continue to hope, though.
Continue to hope. There's always hope.
And this is through 23, correct? Through June of, or
20.
it would be June 30th of 2023. What it is that the governor, what the budget's, right, is.
The proposal, 3-year average, I believe it's ongoing. It will be. They could always change it to temporary, maybe for the next couple of years.
What's currently on the table is for an
It's
ongoing change.
ongoing.
Yeah, but it's a
My
rolling
understanding,
three. It's
it's
a rolling 3 years.
Right.
So it just
To your point.
removes the shocks. It doesn't
Right.
change the real bottom line at the end.
Mm-hmm.
And the last year, so this current year, 2021, 22,
Mm-hmm.
so that's to date right now, right? I mean, we're obviously not finished with the year.
Right.
And so 4,794 ADA
Mm-hmm.
as of this point. And then what's the source for the enrollment data?
Yeah, so the enrollment data is from our student information
Okay,
and our student information system. Same with the attendance. So
And
that was the attendance report data as of December.
and would the enrollment number ever change? I mean, if somebody leaves, then it would go down, right? Or somebody enrolls? Okay, all right, okay.
Yeah. Okay, so next slide, please. So our enrollment and ADA projections for next year and the 2 subsequent years is based on the report that we received from SchoolWorks, our demographers. So you can see our enrollment projections are still declining for the next couple of years. And relative to that would be when we look at our ADA, how we project it based on our current enrollment, an ADA to enrollment ratio of 93%. That too is on a declining trend.
So just out of curiosity, so I literally got an email today in my district from the central office, basically telling everybody that they were advising the schools to put a hold on section scheduling because there was an unanticipated actually increase in enrollment. And I'm not sure, and that it's going to take a few weeks to sort that out, and I'm not sure if everybody understands, what is the cause of that. But do we see anything like that potentially happening right now? I mean, or, because I know that the demographers have done a study, at some point recently, But are we seeing any fluctuation in that projected enrollment, those, at least for next year, those numbers?
Well, just based on our review and some pre-registration information, there are some fluctuations, some optimistic numbers for certain areas, but we really won't know for sure because there's still
Sure.
a lot of.
But we're not seeing a potential increase at this point.
Not at this point, no.
Okay.
Yeah. The ADA is what we're going to focus on because that's really what we get funded. So if we have historically been at 97, 98%, and because of the pandemic, it's gone down, that is one of our proposed solutions in that we start focusing on how can we get our students in school and what do we need to do to increase our attendance rate?
And why are we projecting, because in the prior slide you were saying that historically ADA enrollment 97 to 98%. Why are we projecting 93% across the board going forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. So basically, we have criteria and standards built into the SATS report, and the basis of the criteria is you can go up or down plus or minus 2%. So we could adjust that projection plus or minus 2%, but at the same time, you know, again, we're just being conservative based on our current experience.
Okay.
If we go-
Well, I applaud the being conservative. In this case, where we really see a departure and due to COVID, which is hopefully, you know, receding in the rearview mirror, as I sit with the mask on. I think, you know, and 2% still 2% up is still well below the historical average. So I'm not sure that I agree with being that conservative in terms of the ADA, because I think as COVID disappears, you're going to return to you would return to more historical averages. So if you're allowed to go up, I think that might be more prudent.
Yes, and that is one of our proposals. When we get to that.
The one question I had is then the opposite. So let's say the budget then does come, or everything comes through, and it's not what we anticipated, right? I'm not to be pessimistic, but I'm thinking as far as protection-wise, so that 2% would drop us to the 91. Is that correct?
No, up. I think we're talking
No, but I'm just
95.
saying worse. So if we know that worst case, it would be maybe 91. You see what I'm saying? So that we're looking at that study. Okay, what would 91 look like? 93, 95. So that we have some type of data to look at. Right? You never want to say worst case, but it's, at the same time, it's preparing us and just know this is what we could come up against if it is not right, approved, and worst case scenario because we're using that 2% buffer in the positive or negative.
Right, and plus we're still finalizing the P2 attendance period, and we're hoping it's still at least 93%, but it could even be lower, like you're saying, because you know what happened in January after Christmas break. We did have a spike and a few more students out at that time, so.
I'd like to make another point, and although I think we have to use our demographers, our best estimates going forward, but we also hope, back to the hope idea, that our efforts to better market our district and things like the dual language immersion program and so on and so forth are gonna lead to more enrollment. I'm not saying we should build that into our assumptions, but I do want to inject hope that if we're successful in better marketing the district, we will see increased enrollment as well. But again, I'm all for being conservative, using the experts' demography, but we also have some reason to hope.
Yes.
Thank you.
Next slide. So that this is a review from our second interim multi-year projection based on the assumptions with our COLA at 5.33% for next year and 3.61 for 23-24. It also assumes that we're back to our ADA requirement, with the current year versus prior year instead of the hold harmless provision. And with those assumptions, we are projecting the almost 4.5 million in deficit for next year, and then the 4.7 million in the following year. We do, however, have sufficient reserves for the next couple of years that still meets the 3% minimum. We'll also go over a little bit about that in the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. So when we look at budget balancing, just basics, in order to balance our budget, we're either looking for ways to increase our revenues, or how could we reduce expenditures and find some cost savings measures.
Can we go back one slide?
Oh, one slide?
Yeah.
Sure.
So, actually, sorry, yeah, that one. So 689 less funded ADA.
Yeah.
And so we're saying ADA for this year is 4794, and then that was a decrease from the prior year of when I added up 373. And then if we're projecting going down to 4700, that's an additional 94. So can you help me understand how you calculated the 689 less funded?
5,483 minus 4,700. Doesn't that come out?
So which number?
So it's the ADA 4,700
Right?
compared to 5,483.
That's from the year prior?
Yes, 5,483, 5,483 has been our ADA base for the last couple of years because of the special hold harmless provision that the governor gave us because of COVID. So remember that COVID started in spring of 2020.
Okay.
So they allowed us to use our 1920 ADA because of that.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So next slide, please. So these were some of the line items potentially that we were considering in terms of ways to balance our budget. So in increasing our revenues, we talked about increasing our ADA by at least 100 each year. And that's about 2%, what we talked about in terms of staying within our range and our criteria and standards for our SACS report. So each 100 ADA based on 10,000 average per student or per ADA, because it's really about attendance. It's about $1 million. And if you break it up by school, 10 schools, that's 10 per school. So we think it's doable. And plus, looking at our history, where we've always been 97, 98%, I think we just need to focus on what we can do to increase and improve our attendance. And hopefully with the pandemic also, it will help improve that number.
Can you see do you have already, or could you generate at some point, what percentage ADA, what percentage ADA that would mean? Basically, how optimistic are these perspectives? Is it 1% better than it's been in the worst of times? Is it a much better, be good to know what the ADA percentage would be based on the on this on the next page, please. The revenue enhancement.
Yeah, it's about 2%.
Okay, about
2% more.
So that would be 95%.
Yes.
Correct?
Okay, and the 2% is a cap that comes from the county or the state?
It's a
Anyway,
state standards.
Okay, great.
In order to meet the standards. If you
Thank
go beyond that, then it causes a red flag.
Something like that.
It says not met, not met, not met. So,
But just to reiterate, but in historically, our attendance has been much higher, up in
Much.
the 98 percentile or more or less, is that right?
97, 98%, yes.
Yeah, if you
We've
put it
had
at-
great attendance
If you
rates.
put it at 97%, you're over 200 increase.
Yeah.
Right.
But we're not able to do that.
Right, no, I understand, and,
Still projecting at a conservative rate.
right. And, you know, we have every reason to think that we should return more to a normal pattern. Maybe not exactly normal, but people are going to be a little more concerned, you know. If Johnny or Jane has a sniffle, they might be more likely to stay home, although that could have actually net positives ultimately, because the less disease we spread, but that's another story. Anyway, so that's really as optimistic as we can be. That's sort of within the rules, and because none of us want to be waving any red flags.
Well, I think that what really hit, you know, our EDA was probably the Omicron surge. And so, you know, it seems reasonable to expect an increase of at least 100, you know, next year unless we have some new outbreak. So that part I understand, but can you explain how, you know, how we're calculating the increase in unduplicated?
Yeah, so the unduplicated pupil percentage is the percentage of students that we have in as English learners, foster youth, and low income. So that percentage was really impacted as well because of the universal free meal program. So a lot of our families didn't feel the need to complete our lunch applications. So we really have to make a push on that as well. If you remember, you know, our More Than a Meal campaign, it truly is. It's not just about getting a free lunch. Those applications give us additional funding because that's the way that our state gives us the supplemental and concentration money.
Right.
So anything
Right.
above 55%, we get additional funding.
Right, so the district benefits, but, and under the existing circumstance, or the past circumstance where there was no need to fill out that form and still, and to get the lunch, so now, you know, when we return to normal, if people don't fill out that form, it's gonna hit them in their own pocketbook and hurt the district, right?
Yes.
So if they're gonna have to fill out the form in order to get the free lunch starting next year, or is that a certainty, or is there any talk of that extending?
I believe there's talk of that extending for next year as well. So, but there's also other areas where the families get benefits from completing these applications. It's not just the free meals. I think there's other
Right,
things that they can
that's your
qualify for.
more than a meal sort of campaign to get people to sign up. I understand, thank you.
Yeah.
But as you know, it is challenging. It is challenging because even in a normal year, it can be challenging to get all of those forms filled out.
Yeah.
Can we put that, I mean, I think in the prior 2 years when we had the free and reduced lunch, I don't think the forms went out with like the enrollment packets at the elementary school. They were being passed out as, you know, families were coming to pick up lunches. But can we make that part of the enrollment packets? Because I remember it being that way when my kids were a lot younger, that it was part of the enrollment packet, so families had to fill that out and submit that before they got their class schedules. So,
We have talked about that, yes. Plus, I think the applications also went online, so that
Right.
kind of also, it didn't help, from what I understand, because there's still a lot of families that wanted to do it on papers.
yeah. Okay.
So we'll have to make a push for that. And again, you know, 100,000 is another conservative number. In our best years, I think the district has had like 70–80% of unduplicated pupil percentage. So
And if that were to return, what would that number be?
That number, well, be a lot higher, I would say,
Twice as
probably
much.
like 500,000,
Okay, a lot more.
a lot more.
But currently, we're at about 50% or a little bit below.
We're below 55%.
Yeah, but again,
We're not getting any
there's
funding.
no incentive, it's not necessary for the families to fill out that form to get the free lunch. So it's, even though it benefits their school and, it's another form that's on their table that doesn't have an effect on them directly. Whereas if their kid comes home from school saying, uh-oh, if we don't fill out this form, I'm not gonna get lunch, that's gonna motivate, right?
But it does provide additional services, especially, what's included in our LCAP.
Right.
In terms of, intervention and.
I think a lot of times families aren't sure what the form is all about too, so I think we need to do a better job at explaining what the benefits of filling out the form is for, so that we can probably capture that better.
Yeah.
For some reason, I envision this liaison or family advocacy where it's almost as if it was during the, every 4 years during the census, right? Where someone was coming in the evening, or you're having the local library or even the board in the school multi-purpose rooms open where the families are able to go in the evening or on weekends and complete some of this paperwork and have that censor, that worker from the census approach to make sure that we're letting them know how important the paperwork is.
Yeah, correct, because there's a lot of families who, they pack their lunches for their students and for their kids, and they don't know that, hey, there's additional benefits that the district gets and the school sites get because you're filling out that form, right? And a lot of kids, I've had families tell me, oh, well, my kids don't really like the school lunch, so we just pack, and so we don't fill out the form. So that's something to keep in mind.
Yep, another challenge.
And so now, we go through some of the expenditure reductions that we considered. So in terms of certificated FTEs, because of declining enrollment, we'd be able to decrease about 10 FTEs based on our declining enrollment. So that would be about 1.3 million for next year. And then in the following year, add a couple more FTEs to that. So it would be estimated at 1.5 million.
Is this roughly proportional to, not roughly, is this proportional to the reduction in enrollment? In other words, assuming class size is staying the same, you simply you're dividing the number of students by the, I know this is overly simplified, but you're dividing the number of students by the normal class size, and you're getting a we need this many teachers. Of course, I know there's nuances because of special ed and special programs, and but basically it's keeping our ratios the same because there's less children. We don't need as many positions if that happens.
Exactly. Yes, and that's exactly what we do, and we do our projections based on enrollment per school, the class sizes, and grade levels, how many FTEs we allocated to each school based on that.
Right.
So, I just did a back of the envelope calculation, which is probably somewhat incorrect, right? But if I'm taking a blended FTE rate of like 75,000, I don't know if that's the right number or not, that we're talking about a reduction of 39 FTEs in terms of teachers certificated. Is that roughly the number of people we're talking about reducing?
No, we're using 100,000
Okay.
as a
For everybody?
estimate for an FTE for certificated.
Okay.
So it's about 13 FTEs
For next year?
for next year, and then another couple FTEs in the following year. Because it's ongoing, so unless enrollment starts to increase, the reductions that you make for next year would still carry to the following year. That's the concept. the idea
Okay.
there. And then,
And just for scale, how many positions, how many FTEs exist in those positions right now? So you're talking about a 13 reduction out of how many?
it's about, 13 FTEs total, I don't know, how many FTEs total?
Certificated?
200.
Certificated, about
Yeah, right
almost
under
300.
Right under 300.
Yeah, almost 300,
So 13 of 300.
13%.
yeah. But 300, that's.
Sorry.
No.
It's 300, 13
It's
out of
about a
300.
third.
Right.
Not even a third.
13 divided
It's the
by
same.
280.
It's not a third. And then, in terms of classified FTEs, the 150,000 is something, we put there as a possible potential reduction. We haven't really identified what positions those might be, but we would have to go through and see where.
So that's not as clear of a ratio as you have to have, you're gonna have a teacher roughly for every 28 to 30 kids or something like that. But when it comes to estimating your classified, there's no real clear formula about that, right?
Right.
Because
Because we're talking about
we
everything.
got the same
from-
6 schools, right? 6 elementary schools, 6, right? That we're down to. We have the same 6 elementary schools and in similar facilities and so on and so forth.
Mhm. So we
For
would
the
have to look at our
certificate.
priorities and.
Yeah,
More-
out of curiosity,
more
and
slack,
and when
13
these
out of 300.
figures were determined, right, and for example, the reduction in the certificated FTE, was it a conversation that was being held with the bargaining unit for the teachers? Or was this just from the main office coming up with this projection?
Well, we did engage our management and our labor partners in terms of getting some feedback on potential reductions.
And the reductions you see certificated for 22, 23, that's, the board has seen those as well.
Right, and I'm just like, because it's going on, right, to 23, 24, so I just wanted to make sure that this wasn't, for example, the 22, 24 is something that this is the first time that they're seeing, right? That this is something that they have been involved with or aware of, and this wouldn't be the first time that they see.
And also, can I roll back just a little bit also? What is our typical natural rate of people retiring or leaving the district? Attrition, thank you very much. What's our normal attrition rate? Is that 13 in the ballpark of that or much higher? Or anyone willing to take a guess at that, stab at that?
Not off the top of my head.
I don't think, from previous years, just thinking about it, I don't think there was a huge percentage. It was relatively low, like probably maybe less than 2%. But again, I'm speculating.
Okay.
I do think there is some fluctuation
Yeah.
there year to year.
And we hear of the Great Resignation.
I was going to say COVID is a particularly special year.
Right, because it did. And the other item is, so let's say for 23, 24, if the idea or is entertained that if there are staff that maybe are on that, edge thinking yes or no, whether we as a school district, do we have the opportunity or the availability to offer possibly a golden handshake, right? So that then we can meet the projections that we have.
So classified FTEs, what was our sort of assumption around, a rate? So is it 100, is it 150?
Average for classified for one FTE is about 50 to 60.
So we're talking about
So maybe
2.
about 2 to 3 FTEs.
Okay.
Mhm.
And what's the total number of classified that we have in the district?
It's a pretty equivalent to the teaching staff. It's right under 300.
Under 300 as well, yeah.
Okay.
Real close.
And then the next line
So
item,
just
oh,
back up,
sorry.
with that many people, that probably is close to the natural attrition rate, right? If you're talking about one or two positions, is that what you're talking about? That probably is, with almost 300 positions, you're probably losing that many a year, just typically. People are retiring, people.
One or two?
Maybe
At
more.
least.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
At least,
that's what
maybe
I'm saying,
more.
it's,
A lot more.
right.
One or two.
We can't control in which category they'll be in.
I understand.
But yeah.
I understand. But even within that, if our people have interest in expanding their abilities and areas, there may be as long as as long as we have a similar number of positions, one would hope we can keep our folks, the ones people who are motivated to get into other areas, we have that opportunity. There's a possibility that we can hold that out to them. If that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good answer. Let's say that. Thanks.
Okay, the next line item, offset general fund salaries with one-time COVID funds. So we do have some COVID funds still available for next year that we are allowed to use to offset some of the generally funded salaries. So for next year, that's about $1 million. But for the following year, we won't have that same opportunity. So that's just for next year.
Right. That really is, like the state, that really is sort of a soft landing sort of approach. It's not an ongoing fix, but it does avoid the shock to the system.
Yes.
But also they use it or you're going to lose it, right? There's no recovery. So if let's say we wanted to bank it, we couldn't because according to the stipulations, it has to be used by the end of 2023, correct?
Yeah, some of the funding is 23, some is 24. And then management, one-day furlough is about $20,000 for next year. These are really tough. We're trying to look at every possibility. Management FTEs for the following year is about 150,000. So again, that's probably one FTE.
How does the one-day
for
furlough?
management,
How
including
does the one-day
benefits.
furlough work? What's envisioned?
All of management would take 1 day, non-paid,
Per month or
for the year,
1 day period?
1 day period, yeah, yes. We did that in 2021 as part of a balancing solution at that time.
Right. Now, but that would probably mean there'd be less use of other time as well. Not a one-to-one, but so, and a lot of the other time has essentially cash value, at least upon retirement, right? So there's already our staff already has compared to the private sector, compared to the private sector, already a fair amount of time off, and so adding a furlough day might just mean there's less consumption of vacation time.
Possible. Something to consider for sure.
Thank you.
What categories fall into the management bucket, and how many people are we talking about?
The management is the NUMA group.
Okay.
So it's all of our principals, executive cabinet, and directors,
Okay. And how many
supervisors.
people total are in that category?
Maybe, 35 to 40? I wanna
Is
say.
it 40?
Kathleen says.
40?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see if Marino's, I think it's 40.
Technically, that doesn't include executive cabinet though, right?
Including,
And then your rate that you're calculating when you say reduce management FTEs, what's your rate that you're planning for there?
that's the
I know.
one FTE.
It's one FTE, one FTE.
Including benefits. So it's about one FTE. And then a general reduction in materials and supplies. Our overall budget for unrestricted materials and supplies is about $3 million, so reducing that by 10% gives us $310,000, and if we do that next year and the following year, that should help reduce our expenditures. And then in services and other operating expenditures, $200,000.
So
Oh, sorry.
in terms of the reduction in supplies, what impact would that have on the students?
That's a good question. We're trying to stay away from reducing site allocations as much as we can. So it's materials and supplies for maybe non-instructional type items, but we'd have to look at our priorities.
Also, just to add to that, when we did look at the budget collectively, we did notice that there was some funding not used for some of those supplies. I would like to think that is maybe because during distance learning, we increased our Chromebooks and maybe learned some other ways instead of doing paper or pen. I would like, that is a complete conjecture on my part, right? But something to consider when we think about this number.
Well, if my experience is any indication, it seems like I've been using my printer to do the things that the school's printer used to do, so.
Well, listen, that works too.
I think you get a better deal on ink than I do.
And prior to COVID, I mean, in the elementary schools, definitely, there was always a list that went out to parents and families for donation, class supply donations too. So that really helped out too.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is there's already a priority on not having it affect the classroom, so that's really what I was getting at.
And some of the budget this year also, you know, in terms of Chromebooks, we won't have to repurchase, right? So that's also part of the materials and supplies.
Right.
And the materials and supplies is only in the classroom, or supplies including other
It's other.
expenditures?
It's all, not just classrooms. And in services and other operating expenditures, that includes consultants, professional services, legal fees, utilities, anything we can do to save in those areas. We're estimating we could probably save about $200,000 a year in that category.
Are the savings from the solar arrays figured into that already, or
Yeah, we included that in our current assumptions. That's already been
I
factored
was
in.
guessing, just
Because again, that was part of our, yeah, that was part of our balancing solution the last time we went through this exercise.
Likewise, all the school consolidations, unfortunately, are already factored in here. So, it's unfortunate because it would be great that if we had additional savings, but if we hadn't made those hard decisions, this number would be probably $1 million higher.
I understand.
Right.
Right. Is there any thought of expanding the solar program in that regard? Not that it probably wouldn't hit in either of these 2 years, but it does provide some hope of cost savings, correct?
Yes, we have already started conversations on which sites would be next, because we did plan on having another phase, because the 2 schools that we did were what we were considering phase 1, because we knew that we would be consolidating schools. We didn't want to start adding solar panels to schools that could potentially close. That's why we did the junior high and the high school. So now, yes, we are talking about the next phase.
And just to refresh the communities about that as well, the way that was structured is it didn't actually cost us capital costs. We allowed the solar arrays, and they were financed by another party, and we achieved cost savings without any capital outlay at all.
Correct, yes. It was through what they call a purchasing power agreement. So the contractor, they put up the upfront capital costs, and then they incorporate that into our savings for future years.
Yes, well, obviously, we'll see that going forward. I like that program for that reason, that we're not having to invest any of our money up front. I also like what it says to our community and to our children about trying to use alternative forms of energy. So that's a side benefit.
We've also been in conversations about combining that with shade structures. So we've been exploring the idea of installing shade structures, and it's going to be a sizable cost. But then in conversations with solar, we realized maybe we could combine both those and create shade structures that generate electricity.
Right, or at least even out the cost, right?
2 for 1.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
So reduce materials and supplies 10%. So that means that our annual budget is roughly a little bit over 3 million?
Yes.
Okay. And then reduce services and other operating expenditures. So what is our spend in that category? Our total spend?
Oh, I don't have that in front of me. But it's over 5 million, I want to say. It's a sizable amount.
And then district office budgets, 158,000, so the total spend per year is 1.58 million.
Yes.
Those are the items that we were seeing in the report. Can we go over, can we review?
You're talking about like purchase?
The 4,000 purchase orders, yes.
Yeah. And that item is on top of the two before it. So for some departments, that would result in like, for example, a 10% or 20% reduction versus a 10% reduction in materials and supplies, which starts to be pretty significant, but necessary.
So then the next line item, it's not our favorite item, but the use of one-time reserves is a possibility of 300,000 for next year. And then we do have an online instructional platform called Illuminate that we could discontinue, and that's about a $40,000 cost a year. And just looking at overtime, monitoring that and reducing it by 50% would be about $40,000. So total, the revenue enhancements plus our expenditure reductions, we're up to $4,548,000 for next year, and then $4,728,000 the following year. So we're just a little bit over our target if we were to implement all of these items.
Not that we need a whole report on this, but could you describe the Illuminate program and what the impact would be on the students if it was eliminated?
Can I defer to Ms. Pierce?
So that is we talked a lot about.
When I say you, I mean all of them.
Yes, I understand. Understood.
Not to put you on the spot. So.
We talked a lot about iReady, right, for the elementary. We talked a little bit about Illuminate, kind of replacing our SBAC scores last year during COVID, and that was kind of the state program. You could trade out that for Illuminate. So we've only been doing it for a couple of years. And I think we've discussed a lot about how we want to improve progress monitoring assessments. I think we've heard from the board directly. I think we've all heard that we kind of want to think through what those progress monitoring tools could look like and what those kind of leading indicators for assessment could look like at the secondary levels. There are free assessments out there called IEBs, and they're aligned with the SBAC tests. Now Illuminate has other features like embedded assessments and all of those kinds of things, and so it's one of those tools where if you get really good at using it, right, it could have some benefit. We haven't gotten really good at using it yet, and I say yet because if we continue it, then we would want to get better at it. If we don't, then we would need to find other progress monitoring tools because we have identified that as an area of need.
I can only imagine, let me make it a question instead of a statement. Is there innovation happening in this, in that realm, in that field? Is there a lot of change occurring in terms of what's happening?
I mean, not so much. We've seen this kind of innovation happening for the last few years now, right? So Illuminate's been around for some time. I think permit me to say, I think that because of the distance learning and COVID, what we've seen is a difference in adults' willingness to take up the new technology. And I put myself in that category too, so this is not any sort of statement on tech use. But I think just sort of everyone's sort of willingness and sort of being forced to switch in that space, all of a sudden you're now saying, okay, how can I maintain these tools that I've now learned how to use? And then in some areas, we kind of want to let them go and get back into environmental literacy and get back outdoors and get hands-on learning happening again. So yes and no. It's kind of been out there for some time now.
Great. Well, I'm sorry to take up some time, but so if I understand what's happening with Illuminate is getting rid of it would lose some future potential, but we're not really utilizing that right now anyway. It potentially is something that would impact the options that we would have, but that we're essentially paying for those options now and not using them.
We use
Well,
that.
it varies. Just to be, it's not that we're not, sorry, it's not that we're not using them, but it varies by teacher, I think, right now. And so I think across the board, I don't think we would rank ourselves very high right now in terms of utilizing it to its greatest effectiveness.
But there are some teachers that are using.
Yeah, so I think some teachers would absolutely feel this as a loss. Especially if they were like an early adopter, you know?
But we did use that as a substitute for CASP.
Yeah, that's what I was just saying, yeah.
And
we saw those scores, and we saw having, taken them for the first time, those scores were very low. That's why we then looked at the other scores around the PSAT scores that came out of North Memorial as well. And we discussed kind of, again, we've only had this program for not as many years. We certainly hadn't done that level of testing using Illuminate before. And so you saw those growing pains come out of those assessments for sure.
Right. And this is a subscription, right? So this is cloud-based software, and so we basically just buy a certain number of licenses and log into the cloud. We're not actually hosting this software on our own servers, right?
I believe that to be true.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess based on what you're saying, I do have some concerns about taking an instructional tool away from, particularly these are going to be some of our leading teachers that are using it now. So I have concerns about that.
Yeah, and currently this is in our LCAP. So I just want to.
It's in there we're proposing to pay for it in our LCAP.
Through LCAP, that's fine.
Yeah.
If was there another source of funding, right, that at the site council levels are there that we can adjust to cover that so that the teachers don't lose that tool. And then the one thing that I did want to ask, the use of the one-time reserves, would that be that category for the 300,000 for next school year? Would that be, if we were to rate the expenditure reductions, like let's say offset general fund salaries, would that be number one? Would that be the first thing we'd do? Then leaving, let's say that use the one-time reserves as the last reduction in expenditure that we would touch? If we were to rate that, or is that something that we would look at immediately?
For me, it's the last thing that we would want to look at, because I still feel that having strong reserves really helps keep our district fiscally responsible and stable, because you just don't know all the uncertainties.
So, but back to Illuminate real quick, I just want to understand, so what's proposed is essentially shifting the funding to the LCAP, not discontinuing the...
No. This, in the LCAP currently, because none of this has been approved or decided on, we do have it funded in the LCAP.
I see, so that's a change to the LCAP essentially.
It would be a change, yeah.
Would be, thank you.
I said that to say, we just had a meeting last night, I don't want our community to see that and say, wait a second, we just approved that in the plan, and then see that. I just want
I don't want it either.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could change that to shift or change funding source.
Not to belabor the Illuminate part, but there are, Ms. Pierce made reference to, there are some other really good free services In particular, the one that
Right,
you
it is.
referenced is actually created and monitored by the SBAC company itself. And a lot of districts just use that and had a lot of the abilities to do really fantastic analysis. So with anything, it's like shifting an entire system over to another, entire culture over to another system. It sort of takes time and energy and resources, but that's something that we're exploring.
Okay. So is that staff's recommendation to do that? Regardless of the budgetary impact, would you be moving in that direction in any case?
I think it's, we haven't gone deep into it.
Okay.
But it's definitely a possibility.
I guess if you can't see a theme in what I'm saying is I want to impact the classroom teacher, the classroom environment as little as possible. And you know, if $40,000 is causing us to do something that's gonna have a direct impact, then I think we should rethink that. But if it's something that's part of a progress anyway, then obviously I want to stay out of that.
Yeah.
And we are about 48,000 above our target, so, you know, that is one item that
Can you describe how the
if we can.
reduction of overtime works? Where do you see that? 50% is a fairly substantial piece, but I don't know, where is overtime usually expended?
Well, it's in different areas. I think this year we had a lot of clerical support, some custodial, extra custodial, especially when there are no subs available. Some maintenance also overtime. So a lot of those areas
So-
we would have to closely monitor.
So historically, did we use more overtime recently than we have historically? Had COVID impact that? Is this reduction get back to sort of our normal expenditure of overtime, or is it really is it a real reduction? Is there a chance we can? Because I'm assuming every time overtime is used, it's necessary. So there's going to be an impact.
Yeah, well, I think overtime on the average has been anywhere from 80 to 100,000 a year for this district. So.
The other factor there is anytime a district reduces positions as a cost-saving measure, then it's there's that unintended consequence of requiring then more overtime because there's less people.
Exactly, that's kind of what I was trying to get to, is that, you know, for example, if the overtime's going to go up because you reduce one classified FTE, and then we're counting on it going down, that's not the way to do it.
If I may, I think with any of these things that we're going to see. I mean, they're cuts, and they're hard because it will result in less service. Or I mean, ultimately, these things do impact students and community. And so, yeah, I think their overtime is a good example. And you know, things could be less clean, you know, or things could be not serviced as quickly. It's just the reality of it. But when faced with these kind of hard decisions, that's kind of why we're here, is to sort of wrestle with that.
Yeah, and since 80 to 90% of our budget is services, people, salaries, and benefits, it's hard not to get into those areas. Any other suggestions or comments before we move to the next?
Yes. Back to the revenue. I think given these challenges, we really should be trying to monetize the closed facilities and leasing them out or something like that and see that revenue going in. You know, I know it's hard to figure into a budget, but I really would like to see us making use of our resources so that we can provide funding that can go into the classroom. And hopefully as our enrollment increases, then that allows us to do even more. But during as we're facing a challenge, and the challenge is like 2 years from now, right? The real place where we're facing a non-qualified is in the third year that's off this chart, right? Mm-hmm. Our reserves allow us to go through and have a qualified budget, but we would be, as we talked about during the budget process, we would be irresponsible not to think about what that happens. So I'd like to hope that we would start to find a way to monetize, to create revenue for our closed facilities, from our closed facilities.
I think our vacant facilities perfect way to instead of just outright selling it, which we have done so in the past, that should be a very valuable asset for us to start monetizing.
And I don't know if I would want to see an estimate of that. However, this goes out to 2024. You could imagine that we get some revenue from leasing out those facilities.
Yeah.
Or tell me I'm wrong.
Possibility.
Not today, but
yeah.
today.
No. we would go through the process, obviously, and it probably will take a year or two before we can actually realize some income.
Yes. Well, again,
if we go that route,
you can hire a property manager and start who would do the leasing and process for you, because I know your staff is juggling a bunch of things. So I certainly wouldn't want to do that, but you could conceivably hire a property manager that could start generating some revenue from the leases relatively quickly.
Yeah, it's definitely something that we should probably have a study session on in regards to what we plan to do with those sites, and then how we can monetize and, like you said, maybe lease them out, and what are our potential options for those sites.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, there's a
Absolutely, Member Nguyen, and in fact, maybe more than one.
Yes.
yeah, there's a whole process, and yeah, probably a study session would be a good idea.
But in the short term, I mean, obviously the last 2 years because of COVID, we haven't been able to rent out the multi-purpose rooms at the school sites because, for basketball practices or whatever.
Yes.
Would we be able to continue to do that in next year and then, in the next couple of years?
We started opening up our facilities for use and rent this year, so, but we could look at our rates again. Maybe that's something that we can adjust. We haven't made any adjustments lately.
Because our neighboring school districts have made their adjustments.
Yeah.
Do we make, oftentimes, public entities like this that are not in the business of renting out, right? We end up just covering our maintenance costs. Is that the case here, or do we actually make some bottom line revenue from renting our facilities?
We do make some good money from our facilities rents.
Yeah. Well, I certainly would, I'm hearing a consensus around the table that we'd love to see us make sure we're getting a fair price for our facilities.
Yeah, we have a good program now. It works a lot better than before where it was manual. So we have an online system where our community can go in and book, and it automatically will determine the fees and send them the invoice.
Great.
Yeah, because I
It's a lot
know CYO always books the junior high, the gym.
The gym,
Yeah.
We have quite a few regulars too.
Right. Well, it also plays a role in the school being sort of the center of community as well, and I think that has an enrollment benefit down the road if we're in that realm. So I think it's a good thing. However, we're not a charity. We're here to educate children, And we need to get paid for our resource.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the other thing. I mean, like, if you're looking around the city as a whole, I mean, we've had the tennis courts, which we could have maintained over the years if we had, opened them out and rented the courts out for use, because the courts at Birch Park is really run down, and the one at the New York Community Center is always full. We don't have that many, but, the junior high, we have the tennis courts there, and the high school, but obviously our facilities right now really do need a nice facelift, right? But if we had nice facilities, we would be able to rent those kinds of things out.
Attract.
One thing would also, I mean, are we going to save our kind of final recommendations to the end, or are we sort of pulling that up?
At any time, I mean, at the end, I did have, just some prompts on, whether there's a consensus or any other suggestions.
Because what I think would be helpful is, right now, we're looking at a very high level, and we're just looking at numbers, and we're looking at percentages, but we're not actually seeing the details. And I think that would be really helpful. I mean, so when we say that we're going to cut, 13, teacher at certificated FTE, well, so who specifically are we talking about? And I think that what we want to really focus in on is, we need to be focused on, in terms of being equitable, to say our goal should be how do we maximize essentially class size. And if there are areas where we aren't able to get to full class size, then those should be the ones that should potentially be targeted for, reduction first. Again, it's basically based on demand. But I think it would be helpful to actually see what those projections are. And I mean, and at least I would feel uncomfortable just signing off and saying, well, okay, we're going to cut so much, but we don't really know specifically what we're cutting. So that's, I guess, one observation. The other is just as I do the back of the envelope analysis, it doesn't seem like we're cutting equitably. So just on a percentage basis, we're taking 4% out of certificated, we're taking 1% out of classified, we're taking 2.5% out of management. And I think that if we're gonna ask the district to take a haircut, we should try to have it be as equally spread as possible. And I understand that there are situations, but I'm gonna give everybody a comparable example. Okay, our state is currently going into drought, and right now the water districts aren't saying, well, we're gonna let you cut back 1% and you cut back 5%. They're saying everybody cut back 10%, right? And that's what creates ultimately community. And I'm not saying it needs to be precise, but I think it needs to be equitable. So that's just, that's my perspective on that. But again, I think the details will really show us, again, what's possible and what's not. But where I see an opportunity that it doesn't really seem like we're taking advantage of it at all. So services and other operating expenses, it's $5 million, right? So we're projecting, that's a massive area. We're only taking $200,000 out, that's 4%. And as a former consultant, I know that a lot of services are oftentimes discretionary. And so I think that we should look really hard at that number, because I think that there's probably more that we could take out there.
Yeah, that also includes our utilities, though. So it's really difficult to cut back on, our water, electric.
Sure, but if we could carve that out and we could see, okay, of the 5 million, how much of that is utilities, and then what's left over, and then what composes that.
There's also insurance in there, which is about 600,000. So there's some big ticket items in there.
Sure. So
we've looked at it all, and then in terms of the certificated, we have presented that to the board because we had our March 15th deadline. So the details of that have gone to the board. That's why you don't see any classified FTEs, because if it didn't go to the board by March 15th, we really can't do any reductions for next year. So the details of the FTE reductions have been presented to the board.
But But I don't think that we've seen any data around, okay, what are our current class sizes and are we actually achieving full utilization?
Yeah, so when we do our projections, that's how we project. So if there's, let's say, 100 first graders that are projected to be at a particular school, we maximize it so that we have just enough FTE. So if it's, let's say 30 to 1, that would be your 3 full classes, and then, you have your overage of 10, so you have to decide, are you going to overflow that to other schools, or do we pay the overage for the teacher? So we've gone through that exercise, and
Right, but it would be helpful for us to see the assumptions, right, the numbers.
yeah, so it's all,
It was presented to us in a previous board meeting.
So is this being applied equally to every program? So is this being applied equally to, for example, DLI?
yes.
So we're
Everything.
projecting full enrollment.
Full, yes. So we maximize each class, each FTE when we do our
And you
projections
sometimes use
based on our
combined
class
classes to
size.
make that work, right?
Sometimes we have to do combos, yep.
That's correct. And within what's in the MOU with your bargaining units, right? Because
Correct,
it's
for each
discussed.
grade level, whatever that
Correct.
Yeah.
class size is for that grade level, we've maxed it out.
Understood.
And so I have to respectfully disagree with you in terms of, saying that each section should be, equitably reduced by 10%. We're going through the budget process year after year at the city of Milpitas, and I see it every year, when they say, okay, each department, you have to come back with a 10% reduction in staff. And when our department is small, it's a huge impact when we have to support, 500 and plus employees. So no, for me, it doesn't work that, I don't see it that as being equitable at all when there's larger departments that can, take a much larger hit in terms of their budget and what it is that is needed. So these assessments that I feel, that our current staff is doing here for the district is pretty reasonable.
Well, and that's why I'm saying, I understand that, obviously, 10% of $1 million is bigger than 10% of 10,000, right? And so, so what I'm saying is that there's oftentimes, greater opportunities the bigger your budget.
No, I don't disagree with you on that, yes.
Right.
Of course.
But what I'm driving at here is that if we're only looking at these numbers at a high level, the inclination is just simply to say, let's level set. And so my thought is that either we try to approach parity if we're operating at this level, or what I would really much rather see is, I think what you're driving at, is to say, we need to see the granular level where, what's actually in these numbers around, again, we could pick management, we could pick classified. I mean, we're only doing a 1% cut within classified. It would be helpful to understand and see what are all the services that are falling underneath this, and are there some services that we say, we'd really like to fund these, but we just can't afford that. But right now, we don't have the visibility to be able to say that. And then especially within the services and operating area, I mean, those are big numbers. Now, as Ms. Dela Cruz is saying, okay, there are some big percentages that are consuming that, so utilities, insurance, but it would be helpful to be able to see, okay, if we take out some of these things that really are not, we can't flex on much, and see what the remainder is, I think we could also sharpen our pencils and see, are there further, areas to reduce there, and maybe save some services in other areas. But until we see that granularity, I think it's hard for us to make that decision.
And we've gone through that exercise.
And that's
Right,
what
but we, the
understand.
board haven't, right?
Well,
So
we
that's,
do get that information. I think this is what we need to understand, because every time we find out how many students are enrolled or in a school, that's, if you want to look at it like a pyramid, that's where it starts. Because the amount of students that we have enrolled in Newark Unified then drives everything else.
Correct.
It's at the top. So if they're telling us that fluctuation, if they're being extremely conservative, that number That ADA is what's driving what's here, because if you need X amount of classified to support the number of students that they've provided and X amount of certificated staff, that's what they're giving us for the 2 years. And we went through that, and it was presented to us in the meetings leading up to meeting the state deadline of March 15th.
Correct.
Right, but,
Based on driving numbers. So to say, well, we need to see, we don't know that yet because we don't have the students in their seats yet. It's not 22, 23 yet. So until we have that number, and I just historically always go to that October 2nd or October 30th,
Seabed
right?
Day.
You can see, because that's when seabeds you grab, and then that's your driving number, right? And that's when you receive the information that tells us who your UPP is, how many kids, right? And you're getting that information, then that allows them to support whether this budget balancing plan that they have is functioning, or if they need to go ahead and rely on that 2%, whether it's the plus or minus.
but for example, right, because there's a difference between fixed and variable costs. And so obviously your variable costs are tied to your enrollment. And so your teachers, your certificated are obviously going to be variable. But your other areas, right, it's overhead. And so it doesn't necessarily flex based on your enrollment. And especially, like, nobody can tell me that our amount of legal services, that there is a good ratio that establishes how much we spend on legal services is correlated to what our enrollment is, right? And so these, like, and in my experience, there are lots of little areas like that where if you actually go in and you look and see, we're spending that much on this area, how can that be? And then there are other areas where actually we can be creative, and I don't even know if we've done that. So for example, we're spending a lot on transportation for special ed. Have we actually explored an opportunity where we could maybe partner with another district and have some type of shared services model? So these are all areas that where we can be creative, but we can't be creative until we see the numbers.
We're not the superintendent. So having a high-level discussion that lays out the general plan, things go from general to specific, let's do it this way, and that's appropriate. And our level is at the general. We need to give some direction, is what I understand it. We need to give direction about what areas we go into. We don't need to know the details of what's to happen. We're the policymakers, not the executives of the district.
So I think that you have an incorrect understanding, Member Grindell, of how this works. And so number one, we are the high-level policymakers. We establish goals and objectives, right? But it starts at the top and it flows down, and it is completely within our purview to be looking at this. And I think if it gets down to deciding that, we need to cut in certain areas and that there's going to be an impact on the community, it's we that are the people that ultimately need to make those calls. It's not to be made by staff. And so if we decide based on, the funding that we have that we shouldn't have music, right? Or we shouldn't, do, some other program, we shouldn't do, the rocketry program or whatever that has an impact to the community, that we are the ones ultimately that should be accountable, and we should be the ones that are providing direction to the staff. We provide the direction, staff executes on our direction. And that's how it works everywhere in management.
I'm not in disagreement. You just stated what I just stated.
And so we need the details to be able to make those choices.
Slides.
Yes, I'm in agreement with Member John. Marie, can we move on to the next point?
Yeah, so the next area that I wanted to review was, if you can go to the next slide, Ms. Gutierrez, has to do with the reserve cap. So this is the first time since Governor Brown implemented this new requirement in terms of the state stabilization account. So based on the threshold and the ed code, the reserve cap is triggered for next year, which means that our combined assigned or unassigned fund balance in our general fund and our special reserve fund of Fund 17 cannot exceed 10%. So our budget for next year has to show that we have a reserve of less than 10%. And there is a way to meet that cap, and that's what I wanted to go over today. And it has to do with how we apply our reserves to what's called a committed category in our fund balance. So again, this is the first time I think that the board has had to deal with a reserve cap. And it is part of our budget adoption requirement because our county will be looking at this as part of their review. And if we have any reserve that's above 10%, then they will not approve our budget, basically. So.
And why wasn't this triggered in prior years?
There's a stabilization account at the state level, and if it reaches a certain threshold, then this goes into effect for all school districts.
So they're basically saying that we have a kitty at the state level that could be used for bailouts, for lack of a better term. And if we have so much of that, then we don't want to have you have extra funding because we're double counting. Is that what they're saying?
That's something like that,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
It was, again, during Governor Brown's time, and we thought it would be a while before we would see this day, but we got this notice from CDE, and we're now having to review the requirements and what we need to do to stay within our cap.
So what are
Next
considered,
slide,
what are
please.
considered committed funded?
Yeah, so we'll go over that. Next slide, please.
Oh, they're here.
Excuse me for this small print, but I just wanted to take the snippet just so you know that this is in our board policy. So there's basically 5 major categories in our fund balance, and one is considered non-spendable. And those are items such as our inventory, items that normally can't be converted to cash. And then we have the restricted fund balance, and those are your fund balances that are specifically constrained by either law or providers. For example, all of our federal funds, those are restricted. They're restricted for a particular purpose. And then committed fund balance, this is where the constraint, it's based on specific purposes that could be approved and determined by the board. And we'll go over some examples of what that is. Assigned fund balance are those fund balance that are specific, but they don't fall under either restricted or committed. And unassigned are amounts that are available for any purpose. Okay, so those are the 5 main categories that we could put our fund balance in. Next slide, please. And then I just wanted to show you what it actually looks like in the SACS report, because every time I give you a budget report, it includes the SACS report, and in the SACS report, it does show those different components. So if you look at number 3, where it starts with the components of ending fund balance, there's the non-spendable amounts, and for this particular example, there's $139,000 that represents some prepaid expenses or our inventory, what we hold in our stores inventory. And then committed, as you can see, we have not identified or have ever committed any of the funds, because if we did, you would know that would have to be approved by the board. We do use the assignments, and in this example, we've assigned 1.1 million, and that included like deferred maintenance, money that we set aside for that, and instructional program improvements, and also strategies to improve attendance. So those are some of the categories that were under the assigned. And then the unassigned unappropriated, that's the reserve for economic uncertainties. So going to the next. In doing the calculation on what amount we would have to look at, just based on second interim numbers, we had an ending fund balance of 7.4 million. And if we deduct the non-spendable amount of 139, that leaves the 7,278,000 that would be applied to the cap. But we also have to add the Fund 17 reserves of the 2,354,000. So now we have total reserves of 9,632 that would be applied to this cap. And then we look at our total expenditures, which is about 71,600,000. And that represents 13.4% of our total expenditures. And 10% cap is 7,166,000. So what we have in excess is almost 2.5 million. So this is, again, based on second interim numbers as an example.
So we can move that 2.4 million into any of those 5 categories.
Into committed.
Into committed.
So what we would want to do is move at least 2.5 million into a committed category so that we would stay within our cap. So next slide. So these are some ideas, some options to manage the reserve cap. One is to spend down the reserves, and we did have a line item in terms of, you know, the budget balancing the 300,000. Getting a temporary waiver from the county, although that is an option, we've already been told by the county that that would be very difficult because you'd have to have an extreme situation to get a waiver. The county will not approve just any waiver. So even though it's listed as an option, it really isn't.
Well, particularly because the other options we have are not onerous or
Right.
problematic. Why would we go that route?
Right, yeah, so we've already been told by the county that it would have to be real extreme to get that waiver. The third is to reclassify any of those assigned or unassigned into committed or restricted. So committed, again, is any amounts that could be constrained for specific purposes. It has to be approved by the board, and this would come to you in a form of a resolution, and it has to be done no later than June 30th of this year, because it's for the 22-23 adopted budget. So since we're presenting the budget at the first June meeting, and then that would be our public hearing, and then having final budget adoption at the second board meeting, this would be along that timeline. So our plan would be to have resolution by the second June meeting when we adopt the budget, because we have to incorporate it all into our budget.
So I have a question. So if let's say we were to exercise, right, number 3, to reclassify, at any time in the future, if the situation was to improve, right, statewide and with the funding, would we be allowed to reclassify those?
Yes.
So what we committed as restricted and then go back to there. So even though we would have a resolution, I think that we still have that opportunity to switch the category.
Yeah.
Okay.
The same way that you approve the commitment, you can approve a revision.
Okay.
So it doesn't have to be permanent,
It's not set
and you
in
can
stone or
change
permanent.
it throughout the year up to the end of the year.
Right.
And so number 4 just says that we can't use the reserve for economic uncertainties. That's
We can't call it that.
It can't be categorized as restricted or committed. We can't move that to committed. Although, I mean, you could call it board reserves or whatever, but we couldn't call it reserve for economic uncertainties.
And that was going to be my next question, is if there wasn't an existing category within finance, create or locate a term that we could use in
reclassifying, or does it specifically, we have to go with what we already have in existence?
No, you can classify it as long as it could be justified and there's some backup. It just can't be random. So for example, going to the next slide, please. Here's just some examples of purposes that we could use. Any unspent supplemental or concentration grant
For
that we
justifying?
Mhm. That could be defined. Technology, if we had a plan for refreshing and upgrading any of our technology. We just had our review, so there's some things in there that could potentially be used as backup, for upgrading and refreshing technology. Deferred maintenance, there's plenty in our facilities master plan, as well as the items that we discussed at our last report that could be applied to deferred maintenance and facilities improvements to mitigate declining enrollment. And I think, that 300,000 that we mentioned as part of our balancing plan would be part of that. Any specific equipment or furniture replacement. So for example, if we wanted to replace furniture at certain schools, we could commit funds to that purpose. And then any textbook adoption that we see that are coming up, or any.
So these are
These are some of
in
the.
specific order, it's just basically as higher the need, then that would help us as far as ranking or rating.
Right. And I think you probably need to go to the next slide, but since most of the issue that we're dealing with has to do with adjusting for declining enrollment, why wouldn't we simply, for transparency's sake, put that reserve in that category, since that's really what our reserves are looking at, is addressing the decline in enrollment. We don't have a structural problem in our district where we're spending more than we're bringing in. We have a problem where we're seeing our revenues decline because we're expecting revenue decline because of enrollment dropping. So really, if the excess reserves are in that category, that seems perfectly appropriate and transparent to me.
Yeah. I mean, you could have that as a line item. I don't know that I would recommend you put it all in there, because there's still, you want to make sure that you don't end up with a structural deficit, because if your enrollment goes down, then you have to make sure that there's a respective kind of
No, I understood.
related.
And that's where we're looking at the budget plan and so on and so forth. So I'm just saying that's really what the problem that we're facing right now is.
Right.
So that would seem to be a place where you would put the bulk of the funds, because that's what the bulk of the use would be.
So, I'm sorry, just the time check. It's
Uh-huh.
7:43, and so we have until 8 o'clock, and just wanted to give everybody a heads up. Thank you.
So I did put it in here, your question, Ms. Marquez, regarding the purpose and the commitment that it doesn't have to be permanent, and you do have the opportunity to change it during the year.
We have an entire calendar year.
Mhm.
Well, not calendar, but academic year.
But actually, you're saying you could actually change it at any time. The board would have to act, but
Right.
there's no, it doesn't necessarily have to happen at a set time.
Yeah, so let's say you committed it all to declining enrollment mitigation, and then you wanted to move it to deferred maintenance projects at some point, or however you could do that throughout the year.
So one question and one suggestion. So on number 7, specific deficit spending measures. Sorry, can you give me an example of what that might look like?
Well, if there's like a temporary kind of relief on how we can fix our deficit
Okay,
one time,
okay,
so
okay.
I think that, this is all one time, so I think that's part of it.
So a suggestion for maybe an additional category, and this is building on what Member Grindel and Member Zhang were talking about, is could we create a category called revenue enhancement projects? And so we could put aside funds where if we wanted to go and refurbish the tennis courts and then start to actually use them as a revenue generating asset, we could. Because, I think as you're mentioning, Member Grindal, we really do have fundamentally, a demand problem, right? We do not have enough people right now, and we're going to try our best to change that. But in some ways, it's a structural issue that's happening in the state of California. And so we may continue to be challenged, but if we can start to think about, are there other ways to bring in revenue, that might help to help us.
So you want to add it as one of the,
Yeah, could we just add like a number 8 and just say revenue enhancement projects?
for committed?
But we're, yeah, I'm just
I mean,
trying to keep
she's
the
trying to-
expenditure connection. So.
One of the expenditure would be, well, so you could rephrase it and you could say, deferred maintenance or, deferred maintenance and facility improvements to support, future revenue enhancement.
Right.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. Yeah. That would just,
It might not necessarily be just that,
right.
but again, if we decided we wanted to, maybe there was something else that we could figure out, I don't know, doing fundraising for something, or who knows?
Yeah. So basically, it's an improvement so that
We can
it
generate
helps
revenue.
us market
And
Yes.
charge money.
Charge.
That we could take a facility that's not being used right now and rehab it and then rent it out.
No, and if there's even options, not disagreeing with you, but there's even options to, if, in the case of the tennis courts, which are not used at all, right? They're not even usable at the moment, is that correct?
They're used by
They're
students.
they're using for students.
Okay, but they're not used after hours and they're not used by, you could conceivably have a contract with a tennis club that would do the improvements and in return for a less rent to us, so it's not a capital outlay. But that's not saying that having a capital category wouldn't help us
We could do both.
we could, or we could evaluate it, half of one, half a dozen of one, six of the other, and see what was best for the district. So there are ways to enhance revenue for facilities like that don't even require any capital costs, but having capital costs set aside isn't problematic. Just to back to what the real problem is, we're going to need unless we see a turnaround in enrollment, we're going to need these funds to be in the black in 3 years. So we shouldn't be creating categories that we shouldn't be creating categories that give the impression to the community that we're necessarily going to be spending the money in that direction when we really do know that unless enrollment turns around, we're going to be needing pretty much every penny of these funds. We just happen to have a reserve that's higher than the state requires, but we know in our particular circumstances and the stormy seas that we're on, that we need those reserves. So I'd like them dedicated to the stuff that we really need them for. Just so the community knows what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely correct. I mean, like, because of the cap, we do have an excess amount of reserves for this year. Doesn't mean that we should spend it because outlier years, we're going to be in deficit again. So depending on whether or not we're able to increase enrollment and ADA, right? So, yeah, we just have to be very mindful of that.
Right.
which is an example of the number 7, I think, because of the fluctuation
Yeah.
and depending on the assumptions, right now we're projected to deficit spend for the next couple of years, so we need some mitigation to get us through that so that we can meet our minimum to get us to be positive. Because we've been through qualified, almost negative, and we really would hate to get there again by using our reserves, because I think that's what's happened in the past where.
Right, we should, again, despite all the language the state's throwing around, we're very lucky that the previous boards and staff have set aside these reserves that will allow us to have some time to adjust. So reserves of this level are a very good thing, and we may have to change how they're categorized. Is that the right word? How they're categorized in order to comply with the rules. But let's not kid ourselves. Having these reserves is really, really good.
Yes.
Our goal is to hang on to them.
So to simplify, right, we're basically just creating some different buckets, and we're going to put the money in there, and again, try to see if we can save it for a rainy day. And can we put restrictions on this to say, that this ultimately, any bucket that we put into it, that put the money in, that we, the board, explicitly have to authorize use of that so that we, again, don't fritter it away.
Yeah, that's part of the requirement. Anytime we spend out of the committed or change the committed, it has to go through the board, the same way that it was approved initially.
Okay, so are there any other proposed budget balancing items that any of the other board members would like to propose, or any comments or suggestions to the fund balance, or prioritizing any of the?
I'm not to be repetitive, so I won't be. I made some comments during the discussion of the proposed reduction, so I'd like them to be considered without me restating.
And I just want to appreciate the amount of work that went into providing us this information and the responses received, because then it allows me to look at what's being presented from a different lens. I know it took a lot of work, so I commend as well previous boards and the fact that to be told you need to spend this money instead of, no, you need to find this money, but the money that, the reserves exist and that we're having to work to actually recategorize. Thank you.
Yes.
I think that concludes the study session.
Thank you very
So back
much.
to the dais and
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you.
appreciate everything.
Thank you.
Thank you for the input.
Yes,
Thank you.
everything. Thank you. Appreciate all the feedback and the comments.
I recommend them.
Oh, I didn't know they were open. My God, I would have grabbed one.
I had one.
Excellent. I saw the tape with that.
Okay. Thank you again for the presentation and the study session tonight, Ms. Dela Cruz, Superintendent Triplett, Ms. Pierce, and Ms. Ingham Waters. And thank you, Ms. Gutierrez, for making sure that we're up and running and everything's fine. We appreciate you all. And with that, may I get a motion to adjourn the meeting, please?
I'll move to adjourn the meeting.
Motion made by Member Grindel, seconded by Member Marquez. How do you vote, Member Zhang?
Yes.
Member Marquez?
Yes.
Member Hill?
Yes.
Member Grindel?
Yes.
I'm also a yes. Meeting adjourned at we have 5 ayes. Meeting adjourned at 7:54 p.m. Thank you.